The first time a person gets into a car and drives to some place new, the discovery process causes a heightened sense of awareness and a perception that time has slowed down. Each subsequent trip to that same destination involves fewer discoveries, less awareness, and the perception of less time spent to get there. After enough trips, our brain goes on to autopilot, and our sense of time collapses even further. The Familiarity Contraction Principle is a concept that explains the perceived reduction in time, but also explains how our familiarity with a specific outcome or end goal will increase both the likelihood that it will happen and the efficiency with which it will occur. As we increase the body of information surrounding a specific aspect of the future, we increase our understanding of it. Our ability to plan and manage our own future is directly related to how familiar we are with it, and that is where we can begin to uncover some truly profound insight. First, a little background. The idea of the Familiarity Contraction Principle was initially proposed by Drew Crouch, a good friend and formerly a top-level executive at Ball Aerospace. He brought up the concept during one of our monthly meetings where we typically set out to solve some of the greatest problems in the world. Our initial discussion started with what we noticed as a perceived reduction in driving time, but upon further reflection, some new possibilities began to blossom. As you will soon see, familiarity is an enormously valuable tool that can be applied to countless situations. In this context, familiarity is a way of adding layers of confidence to any given situation. Example number 1. When entering a dark room, our first instinct is to search for cues. If there's a small amount of light, our impulse is to look for visual cues. Once we've decided how much we can rely on visual information, we move on to our other senses, looking for auditory signals, smells, things we can touch, and perhaps even taste. If it is a room we have been in before, we can quickly race through our memory cells to correlate known information with whatever new information we are uncovering. Once we reach the other side of the room, we have methodically logged everything we found to be pertinent, so any subsequent trip across the room can take place in far less time. The speed with which we can move through a dark room is directly related to how familiar we are with it. Example number 2. A person who works on an assembly line is well aware of the efficiencies that can be gained through repetition. A craftsman who works on building clocks gains tremendous amounts of efficiency between the first time a clock is built and the 100th time. After multiple iterations of the same routine, the assembly person instinctively knows where to reach for each subsequent part. They learn how to best grasp and position the new part to ensure they're grabbing the right component, how the gears are aligned, and screws are properly seated. Over time, the movements become fluid and instinctive. There is little brain power needed for each new assembly as the brain shifts into autopilot and the person doing the work simply zones out, letting their mind wander as their body simply goes through the motions. Every manufacturing plant manager is well aware of the value of familiarity. Example number 3. When children are first introduced to the alphabet, they are shown the letters repeatedly to improve familiarity between the character shapes and the corresponding sounds used to form words. The slow, methodical process of converting new brain cells to more experienced ones is an exercise in familiarity building and also an essential part of learning. Over time, the micro-decisions needed to distinguish between one character and another becomes second nature, and our brain jumps quickly past the individual letters and only sees the character groupings as complete words. Here are a couple other ways forces associated with familiarity have been demonstrated. Number 1, exposure effect. People tend to develop a preference for things merely because they're familiar with them. In studies of interpersonal attraction, the more often a person is seen by someone, the more pleasing and likable that person appears to be. Similarly, mirror exposure typically reaches its maximum effect within 10 to 20 presentations. And some studies even show that liking may decline after a long series of exposures. For example, people generally like a song more after they have heard it a few times, but multiple repetitions can reduce this preference. Number 2, hindsight bias. Hindsight bias postulates that people will perceive certain events to be more predictable after the fact than they appeared before they had occurred. People believe that a disaster could have been avoided when they are actually misattributing familiarity knowledge to a time before it was available. Contrary to popular thinking, familiarity is not just about the past. Rather, our ability to develop a greater level of awareness about the future can give us a significant competitive advantage. Every vision of the future begins as a vague concept. If there is enough meat on the bones, the idea begins to grow. But the traditional path of letting ideas grow on their own tends to be extraordinarily slow. Weeks turn into months, and months often turn into decades as ideas languish in their own inability to reach the minds that most need them. In much the same way a bad food system fails to provide the needed food and nourishment to starving people in remote areas, our idea network has suffered from broken patterns and constant disconnects. Any idea left to survive on its own has little chance of surviving, but an idea combined with hundreds or even thousands of similar or related ideas can quickly reach the point of critical mass. Done correctly, idea clusters create their own center of gravity. If we create a vision of the future and couple it with the right mechanisms for attracting other ideas, suddenly they take on a life of their own. To better illustrate this concept, think of some future concept as a piece of papier-mâché that starts with a wire framework. Each new idea serves as another piece of paper added to the frame, giving it mass, dimension, and realism. Over time, the original collection of wires becomes a visual, touchable, finished work that we can both physically and intellectually interact with. Similarly, if we start with some future concept and start telling stories about it, adding illustrations, animations, videos, surveys, and interviews, the entire body of work surrounding the original idea creates its own gravitational pull, making it an attractor.